Maxwell Rothschild stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan penthouse, watching snowflakes dance against the December sky. The crystal tumbler in his hand caught the warm light from his study, amber liquid swirling as he contemplated the ultimatum he'd just delivered to his son. "You have until Christmas to get married," he'd told James earlier that day, "or you'll lose your inheritance and your position in the company." The words had felt like acid in his mouth, but Maxwell knew it was necessary. At 32, James was still the same irresponsible playboy he'd been in his 20s, more interested in making headlines with his latest scandal than learning to run Rothschild Industries. The company Maxwell had built from nothing into a real estate empire worth billions needed a steady hand to guide it into the future, not a reckless heir who treated life like an endless party. James had stormed out of his office, of course. "You can't control my life forever," he'd shouted, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the awards on Maxwell's walls. But Maxwell knew his son would come around. He always did when the threat of losing his trust fund loomed. What Maxwell hadn't expected was the phone call he received just hours later. "Dad!" James's voice had been tight with anger and something else, perhaps triumph. "I'm getting married to Sarah Mitchell. You remember her, don't you? The cleaning lady's daughter." The crystal tumbler slipped from Maxwell's fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor. Sarah Mitchell. The name hit him like a physical blow, dredging up memories he'd tried desperately to bury 15 years ago. Sarah Mitchell, the daughter of Eleanor Mitchell, who had worked as part of the cleaning staff at Rothschild Industries until that terrible night. The night that had changed everything, though only Maxwell and Eleanor knew the full truth of what had happened. And now his son was going to marry her daughter. Maxwell's hands trembled as he picked up his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the private investigator he kept on retainer. "I need everything you can find on Sarah Mitchell," he said, his voice rough with barely controlled emotion. "Everything." The next morning, Maxwell sat in his office, staring at the file his investigator had delivered. Sarah Mitchell, 29, single mother to a 6-year-old boy, working 2 jobs, waitressing at night and as a substitute teacher during the day, living in a modest apartment in Queens, struggling to make ends meet. No criminal record, excellent credit despite her financial challenges, active in her local community. But it was the photograph that captured his attention. Sarah had her mother's eyes, deep brown, intelligent, with that same look of quiet determination that had always made Maxwell uncomfortable. Even in this simple ID photo, there was something about her gaze that seemed to pierce right through him, as if she knew all his carefully guarded secrets. "Mr. Rothschild," his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Your son is here with Ms. Mitchell." Maxwell straightened his tie, tucking the file into his desk drawer. "Send them in." The door opened, and James strode in, his usual cocky grin firmly in place. But it was Sarah who commanded the room's attention. She wore a simple blue dress, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, and she met Maxwell's gaze without flinching. In that moment, she looked so much like her mother that Maxwell had to grip his desk to steady himself. "Dad," James said, wrapping an arm around Sarah's waist. "Meet my fiancé. We're getting married on Christmas Eve." Sarah's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mr. Rothschild," she said softly. "It's been a long time." The way she said it, the slight emphasis on long time, made Maxwell's blood run cold. Did she know? Had Eleanor told her daughter everything about that night? "Sarah," he managed to say, his voice surprisingly steady, "this is unexpected." "Life is full of surprises, isn't it?" Sarah replied, and there was something in her tone that made Maxwell certain this was no coincidence. This wasn't just his son's rebellious response to an ultimatum. This was something else entirely. "James, could you give us a moment?" Sarah asked, turning to smile at her fiancé. "I'd like to speak with your father alone." James looked between them, confusion flickering across his face. "Sure, babe. I'll wait outside." As soon as the door closed behind James, Sarah's smile disappeared. She took a step forward, placing both hands on Maxwell's desk and leaning in close. "Did you think I wouldn't find out?" she whispered. "Did you think my mother would keep your secret forever?" Maxwell felt the color drain from his face. "Sarah, whatever you think you know, I know everything," she cut him off. "About that night, about what you did, about why my mother really left Rothschild Industries." She straightened up, smoothing her dress. "And now your son wants to marry me. Funny how life works out, isn't it?" Before Maxwell could respond, she turned and walked to the door, pausing with her hand on the handle. "The wedding is in 3 weeks, Mr. Rothschild. I suggest you start preparing your father of the groom's speech. After all, we wouldn't want any uncomfortable truths coming out during the reception, would we?" The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Maxwell alone with the weight of his past pressing down on him like a physical force. He reached for his phone with shaking hands, dialing a number he hadn't called in 15 years. "Eleanor, we need to talk. It's about Sarah and James." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like an eternity before Eleanor's voice, aged but still achingly familiar, came through. "I was wondering when this day would come, Maxwell. I've been waiting for it for 15 years. Maxwell closed his eyes, feeling the carefully constructed walls of his life beginning to crumble. "What does she know, Eleanor? What did you tell her?" "Everything," Eleanor replied simply. "She knows everything. And now your son is going to learn who his father really is." The line went dead, leaving Maxwell staring at his reflection in the window, watching as the first snow of December began to fall over New York City. In 3 weeks, his son would marry Sarah Mitchell, and all the secrets he'd kept buried for 15 years would finally come to light. Unless he found a way to stop it. Will Sarah's dark secret destroy James's family legacy? Watch till the end to discover the shocking truth that changes everything. The next morning, Maxwell found himself in a small diner in Queens, far from the luxurious restaurants he usually frequented. Eleanor sat across from him, stirring her coffee with mechanical precision, just as she had done every morning when she worked at Rothschild Industries. 15 years had etched fine lines around her eyes and threaded silver through her dark hair, but her gaze was as sharp as ever. "You look terrible." "Maxwell," she said, setting down her spoon with a quiet clink. "Having trouble sleeping?" Maxwell ignored the jab, leaning forward. "Why now, Eleanor? After all these years, why did you tell her?" "I didn't." Eleanor's lips curved into a bitter smile. "Sarah found out on her own. She discovered the letters." Maxwell's heart stopped. "What letters?" "The ones you wrote to me after that night. The ones where you confessed everything." Eleanor reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of yellowed envelopes, held together with a faded rubber band. "I kept them all. Insurance, I suppose. Or maybe I just needed proof that it really happened." Maxwell stared at the letters, his throat tight. "I thought you burned them. You said you burned them." "I lied." Eleanor pushed the letters across the table, "just like you lied about everything else." Before Maxwell could respond, the diner's bell chimed, and Sarah walked in. She wore scrubs now, her teaching uniform replaced by her waitressing attire, and carried herself with the same quiet dignity her mother had always possessed. "Mom?" Sarah stopped at their table, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. "What's going on?" "Just catching up with an old friend," Eleanor said, but her voice trembled slightly. "Isn't that right, Maxwell?" Sarah's gaze fell to the stack of letters on the table, and something flickered across her face. Recognition, perhaps, or confirmation of something she'd long suspected. "Those are the letters," she said softly, "the ones I found in the attic last month." Maxwell's hand shot out to grab the letters, but Sarah was faster. She snatched them up, clutching them to her chest like a shield. "You know what these say?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "They tell quite a story, Mr. Rothschild, about the night of the charity gala 15 years ago, about the missing funds, about how you framed my mother for embezzlement when she discovered your scheme." Maxwell felt the blood drain from his face. "Sarah, please." "But that's not even the worst part." "Is it?" Sarah's eyes blazed with 15 years of accumulated rage. The worst part is what happened after. How you threatened to have her arrested if she didn't leave quietly. How you destroyed her reputation so thoroughly that she could never work in corporate New York again. How you forced us into poverty while you got richer and richer from the money you stole. Eleanor reached for her daughter's hand. "Sarah, maybe this isn't the place." "No, Mom, he needs to hear this." Sarah turned back to Maxwell, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "Do you know what it's like to watch your mother work 3 jobs just to keep a roof over your head? To see her hands bleed from scrubbing other people's floors because no office would hire her with the reference you gave? To eat nothing but ramen noodles for a week because there wasn't enough money for real food?" Maxwell felt sick. He remembered signing those reference letters, remembered the cold satisfaction he'd felt knowing Eleanor Mitchell would never threaten his position again. He'd never thought about what it would mean for her daughter. "And now," Sarah continued, "your son wants to marry me. James has no idea who his father really is, does he? No idea that the fortune he's set to inherit was built on stolen money and ruined lives. The money was already gone," Maxwell found himself saying, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "The company was going under. I had to do something. You had to steal from your own charity." Sarah's laugh was bitter. "The money that was supposed to help single mothers get back on their feet? That's what you had to steal?" Maxwell flinched. He remembered that night with painful clarity, the panic when he'd realized Rothschild Industries was on the brink of collapse. The desperate plan to siphon funds from the charity to save the company. The sickening moment when Eleanor had walked into his office with the incriminating documents. "I did what I had to do to save the company," he said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "And now I'm doing what I have to do," Sarah replied. She pulled an envelope from her pocket and placed it on the table. "This is a copy of all the evidence, the letters, the bank statements, everything. I have the original somewhere safe. If you try to stop this wedding, if you do anything to hurt my mother or me again, it all goes public." Maxwell stared at the envelope, feeling the walls closing in. "You're blackmailing me. I prefer to think of it as justice." Sarah straightened up, squaring her shoulders. "The wedding will happen on Christmas Eve. You'll give James your blessing. You'll welcome me into your family with open arms. And maybe, if you're very lucky, I'll decide not to tell your son what kind of man his father really is." She turned to her mother. "I have to get to work. Will you be okay?" Eleanor nodded, reaching up to squeeze her daughter's hand. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Go on." They watched Sarah walk away, her head held high despite the obvious weight of her emotions. When she was gone, Eleanor turned back to Maxwell, her eyes sad. "You know what the worst part is," she said softly. "Sarah and James actually love each other. They met months ago before she found the letters. This could have been a beautiful thing, your son and my daughter healing the rift between our families. Instead," she stood up, gathering her purse, "instead, you get to live with the knowledge that your past sins might cost your son his happiness. Because if he ever finds out the truth about you, Maxwell, he'll never forgive you." Maxwell watched her leave, the untouched coffee growing cold between them. Through the diner's window, he could see Sarah starting her shift, smiling warmly at customers as she took their orders. She looked so much like her mother had 15 years ago, before he'd destroyed everything. His phone buzzed, a text from James. "Having dinner with Sarah's family tonight. You should come. Dad, show some support for once." Maxwell stared at the message, feeling the weight of his choices pressing down on him. In 3 weeks, Sarah Mitchell would become his daughter-in-law, bringing with her all the secrets and lies he'd spent 15 years trying to forget, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. Unless... He picked up his phone again, dialing a different number. "It's me," he said when the line connected. "I need you to find something on Sarah Mitchell, something we can use. There has to be something." But even as he spoke the words, Maxwell knew he was only digging himself deeper into a hole that had already cost him too much. Has someone's past actions ever changed your entire life? Hit like if you believe karma always finds its way? James Rothschild sat in his Tesla, parked outside Sarah's modest apartment building in Queens, watching her through the living room window. She was helping her son, Tommy, with his homework. Their heads bent together over what appeared to be a math worksheet. The simple domesticity of the scene made his heart ache in a way he hadn't expected. He hadn't told his father about Tommy yet. Somehow, that detail had never come up during their confrontation in the office. James smiled, remembering how he'd met Sarah and her son 3 months ago at the community center, where he'd been doing court-mandated volunteer work after his latest DUI. Tommy had been the one to approach him first, asking for help with the basketball. "You're tall," the 6-year-old had said matter-of-factly. "Can you show me how to shoot hoops?" James had spent the afternoon teaching Tommy basic basketball moves, while Sarah watched from the sidelines, initially suspicious but gradually warming to his genuine interaction with her son. When Tommy finally made his first basket, his celebration had drawn Sarah over, and James had found himself captivated by her smile, real and warm, unlike the practiced expressions he was used to seeing at society events. Now, watching them through the window, James felt a gnawing uncertainty in his stomach. Something was wrong. His father's reaction to Sarah had been strange enough, but it was Sarah's behavior that really bothered him. The way she'd insisted on speaking to his father alone, the tension he'd felt in the room afterward, the way his father had looked like he'd seen a ghost. His phone buzzed. Another message from his father. "Son, we need to talk. Come to the office tomorrow morning. There are things you need to know about Sarah." James frowned at the message. His father had been acting increasingly erratic since the engagement announcement. The private investigators he'd hired weren't exactly subtle. Sarah had spotted them following her twice already. Making a decision, James got out of the car and headed up to Sarah's apartment. She answered his knock with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "James, I wasn't expecting you tonight." "I know." He stepped inside, watching as Tommy gathered his homework, and headed to his room after a quick hug. "We need to talk, Sarah." She sat on the worn couch, tucking her legs under her. "About what?" "About whatever's going on between you and my father." James ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Don't tell me there's nothing. I'm not as stupid as everyone thinks I am." Sarah's expression softened. "I've never thought you were stupid, James." "Then be honest with me. What happened in my father's office? Why is he so desperate to stop this wedding?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Your father knew my mother. She worked for him 15 years ago. At Rothschild Industries? As part of the cleaning staff, right?" "Yes. But there's more to it." Sarah stood up, pacing the small living room. "James, there are things about your father, about what happened back then." Before she could continue, there was a knock at the door. Sarah tensed, then relaxed when she checked the peephole. "It's my mum." Eleanor Mitchell entered the apartment, stopping short when she saw James. "Oh, I didn't realize you had company." "It's okay, Mom. James was just—" Another knock interrupted her, this one more insistent. Sarah checked the peephole again and went pale. "It's your father." James moved to the door before Sarah could stop him, throwing it open to find Maxwell Rothschild standing there, looking more disheveled than James had ever seen him. "Dad, what are you doing here?" Maxwell's eyes moved past James to Eleanor, who stood frozen in the middle of the room. "Eleanor," he said softly, "you haven't changed." "Neither have you, Maxwell," Eleanor replied coldly, "still showing up where you're not wanted." James looked between them, feeling like he was watching a play where everyone knew their lines except him. "Would someone please tell me what's going on?" "I can explain everything," Maxwell said, stepping into the apartment. He pulled an envelope from his coat, the same one Sarah had left at the diner. "But first, there's something you need to see." "No!" Sarah lunged for the envelope, but Maxwell held it out of reach. "He deserves to know the truth, Sarah, about everything." "The truth?" Sarah's laugh was bitter. "You wouldn't know the truth if it bit you, Mr. Rothschild. The truth is that you—" She was cut off by Tommy's voice from the hallway. "Mom, is everything okay?" The room fell silent as Tommy appeared. Rubbing his eyes sleepily, Maxwell stared at the boy, his face draining of color. In the dim light of the apartment, with his dark hair and familiar features, Tommy could have been James at that age. "Sarah," Maxwell said, his voice shaking. "How old did you say Tommy was?" 6, Sarah replied, moving to stand between Tommy and Maxwell. "He's 6 years old." Maxwell swayed slightly, reaching out to steady himself against the wall. 6 years ago? That was when... "When what, Dad?" James demanded. But he was starting to put the pieces together. 6 years ago had been his wild phase, when he'd spent most of his time in an alcoholic haze, moving from party to party, woman to woman. "James," Sarah said softly, "there's something I need to tell you about Tommy." But before she could continue, Maxwell collapsed, clutching his chest. The envelope fell from his hand, letters spilling across the floor like autumn leaves, each one carrying a secret that could destroy everything. "Dad!" James rushed to his father's side as Eleanor called 911. Sarah gathered the letters quickly, stuffing them back into the envelope while James was distracted. She met her mother's eyes across the room, a silent understanding passing between them. The truth would have to wait, but not for much longer. As the sound of sirens filled the air, Sarah watched James, holding his father's hand, whispering reassurances. She placed her hand on Tommy's shoulder, feeling the weight of 6 years of secrets pressing down on her. "Is Grandpa going to be okay?" Tommy asked innocently, and Sarah felt James's head snap up at the word Grandpa. The sirens grew louder as Sarah struggled to find an answer that wouldn't shatter everything she'd built. But perhaps it was too late for that. Perhaps it had always been too late, from the moment she'd found those letters in her mother's attic and realized that the father of her child was the son of the man who had destroyed her family. The paramedics were coming up the stairs now, their footsteps echoing in the hallway. Soon they would take Maxwell to the hospital, and Sarah would have to decide which truth to tell first, the one about the stolen money or the one about Tommy's father. Either way, Christmas was going to be very interesting this year. What would you do if you discovered your child's other parent was connected to someone who destroyed your family? Share your thoughts below. The hospital waiting room was eerily quiet at 3 in the morning. James sat with his head in his hands, trying to process everything that had happened. His father was stable, a mild heart attack, the doctors said. But that was the only clear thing about this night. Tommy's word kept echoing in his head. Grandpa. He looked across the waiting room at Sarah, who sat rigidly in an uncomfortable plastic chair, the envelope of letters clutched tightly in her lap. Eleanor had taken Tommy home hours ago, leaving them alone with the weight of unspoken truths between them. "Were you ever going to tell me?" James finally asked, his voice hoarse. Sarah met his eyes. "Which part? About Tommy being your son, or about your father stealing millions from his own charity and destroying my mother's life to cover it up?" James felt like he'd been punched in the gut. "Tommy is... You're sure? Remember Angela Martinez's graduation party? 6 years ago." Sarah's voice was quiet but steady. "You probably don't. You were pretty drunk. I was working as a waitress there. We talked all night, and one thing led to another. I tried to find you afterward, but you'd left for Europe the next day. By the time I discovered I was pregnant, you were photographed with some Italian heiress in Positano." James remembered that summer in fragments, a haze of parties and poor decisions before his father had finally forced him into rehab. "Why didn't you try harder to find me? I had a right to know." "Did you?" Sarah's laugh was bitter. "The party boy son of Maxwell Rothschild, who treated women like disposable toys? I saw the tabloids, James, a different model every week. What would you have done if I'd shown up pregnant? Thrown money at me to make me go away?" "That's not fair," James protested, but the words felt hollow. She wasn't wrong about who he'd been back then. "Want to know what's really not fair?" Sarah opened the envelope, pulling out one of the letters. "Listen to this. Eleanor, I know what I did was unforgivable. The money is gone, all 20 million of it. I had to save the company, but I never meant for you to take the fall. Your daughter will suffer for my sins. And that knowledge will haunt me forever. Maxwell. James felt the room spin. 20 million? From a charity? A charity for single mothers. Sarah's voice cracked. Ironic, isn't it? The money that could have helped mothers like me was stolen by your father, who then made my mother the scapegoat. She lost everything, her job, her reputation, her future. We ended up in a homeless shelter for 3 months. James stood up abruptly, pacing the waiting room. This can't be true. My father, he built Rothschild Industries from nothing. He's a good man. Is he? Sarah watched him pace. Or is that just what you needed to believe? Like I needed to believe you'd changed when we met again at the community center. Like I needed to believe that falling in love with you wasn't the universe's cruelest joke. James stopped pacing. Was any of it real? Us? Or was this all about revenge? Sarah's eyes filled with tears. That's the worst part. James, it was real, is real. I didn't plan to fall in love with you. When we met again, I didn't even know who you were at first. You were just this kind man who spent hours teaching my son, your son, how to play basketball, who made me laugh for the first time in years, who looked at me like I was someone special, not just a waitress or a substitute teacher. Then why the blackmail? Why threaten my father with exposure? Because he deserves it. Sarah stood up, tears streaming down her face. Because every time I had to choose between buying Tommy new shoes or paying the electric bill, I thought about the millions your father stole. Because every time I watch my mother come home with bleeding hands from scrubbing floors, I remembered how he destroyed her life. Because every Christmas when Tommy asked why we couldn't afford presents like his friends got, I thought about how different our lives could have been. James felt his own eyes burning. Tommy, does he know about me? No, Sarah whispered. He thinks his father was a man I dated briefly who died before he was born. It was easier than explaining that his father was alive but didn't know he existed. Before James could respond, a doctor appeared in the waiting room. Mr. Rothschild, your father's awake. He's asking for both of you. They found Maxwell propped up in his hospital bed, looking old and frail in the harsh fluorescent light. His eyes fixed on Sarah as they entered. I remember now, he said softly. That graduation party. James was out of control that summer. I hired extra staff to keep an eye on him at events. You were one of them, weren't you, Sarah? Not just a waitress, but someone Eleanor asked to watch over him. Sarah nodded slowly. Mom was still trying to protect your family, even after everything you did to us. She knew James was heading for trouble. So she asked me to keep an eye on him at parties where I worked. She didn't want him to end up hurt, or worse. Maxwell closed his eyes, a tear rolling down his cheek. All these years, Eleanor was still looking out for my son, while He opened his eyes, looking at James. I'm so sorry, son. For everything. The charity money, the cover-up, what I did to Eleanor and Sarah. I was desperate. The company was failing. I thought I could put the money back before anyone noticed, but then Eleanor found out and I panicked. So you destroyed her life, James said quietly. You let an innocent woman take the fall for your crime. And now, he looked at Sarah, at the features he suddenly recognized in Tommy's face. Now I find out I have a son who's been living in poverty while I spent millions on parties and cars and God knows what else. James, Sarah started. But he cut her off. No, Sarah, let me finish. He turned back to his father. All my life, you've lectured me about responsibility, about living up to the Rothschild name, but you're a thief and a liar. You ruined lives to save your own skin, and because of your actions, I missed out on 6 years with my son. Maxwell reached for his son's hand, but James stepped back. The wedding is still on, James said firmly. Not because of blackmail or threats, but because I love Sarah, and after the wedding, we're going to make this right. All of it. How? Maxwell asked weakly. First, you're going to confess to everything. We'll pay back the charity money with interest. Then, you're going to publicly apologize to Eleanor and clear her name. James took Sarah's hand. And then we're going to be a family, all of us, including Tommy. Sarah squeezed his hand, fresh tears falling. "James, I know we have a lot to work through," he said softly, "and I know I don't deserve forgiveness from you or Tommy, but I want to try. I want to be the father he deserves. The man you deserve." Maxwell watched them, his face a mask of regret and resignation. "The company, the scandal, will destroy it." "Maybe it should be destroyed," James replied. "Maybe we need to rebuild it into something honest, something good." He looked at Sarah. "Something our son can be proud of." Outside the hospital room, the first light of dawn was breaking over the city. Christmas was just days away, and nothing would ever be the same. But as Sarah looked at James, she saw something she hadn't expected to find in this whole mess. Hope. The truth was finally coming to light, and with it, the possibility of healing wounds that had festered for 15 years. It wasn't the revenge she'd planned, but maybe it was something better, a chance for real justice and a future where her son would know both his father and his grandfather, not as the men they had been, but as the men they could become. Don't miss more powerful stories of redemption, family secrets, and unexpected love. Subscribe now to witness more life-changing moments. Christmas Eve arrived with a gentle snowfall over New York City. The Rothschild Mansion's grand ballroom had been transformed into an intimate gathering space, very different from the ostentatious wedding that had originally been planned. Instead of hundreds of society guests, only a small group of people who truly mattered were present. Maxwell Rothschild stood by the window, watching the snow fall, his hand absently rubbing his chest where his heart had protested just days ago. The past week had been a whirlwind of confessions, legal meetings, and press releases. Rothschild Industries' stock had taken a hit when he'd publicly admitted to the charity theft, but somehow that seemed insignificant now. "Are you ready?" Eleanor's voice came from behind him. She wore a simple but elegant navy dress, her silver hair swept up elegantly. Maxwell turned to face her. "Eleanor, I don't deserve to be here." "No," she agreed, stepping closer. "You don't. But Sarah and James want you here, and more importantly, Tommy wants his grandfather here." The mention of Tommy made Maxwell's heart clench. The boy had visited him in the hospital after everything came out, full of questions about his newly discovered family. His innocent excitement about having a real dad and a grandfather had broken something in Maxwell's carefully constructed walls. "I've been thinking about that night," Maxwell said quietly. "When you caught me with the charity ledgers, you could have gone to the police immediately. Instead, you came to me first, tried to reason with me. You were trying to save me from myself, weren't you?" Eleanor's eyes softened slightly. "I remembered the Maxwell I used to know, before power and greed changed him. The man who started that charity because he truly wanted to help single mothers. I thought if I appealed to that man maybe, but that man was already gone," Maxwell finished. "And instead of finding him, you found a coward who destroyed your life to save himself." "Yes," Eleanor said simply, "but maybe that man isn't completely gone. The Maxwell I knew is still in there somewhere. I saw him in the hospital when you confessed everything. I saw him yesterday at the press conference when you cleared my name. And I see him now, trying to make amends." Before Maxwell could respond, James appeared in the doorway, looking handsome in his wedding suit. "Dad, it's time. The ceremony was everything the original wedding wasn't meant to be. Honest, intimate, and real." Sarah walked down the aisle in a simple white dress, her hand on Tommy's arm, as he proudly performed his duties as both ring-bearer and escort. The boy beamed at James, his father, who stood waiting with tears in his eyes. When it came time for the vows, James went first, his voice thick with emotion. "Sarah, I stand here a different man than the one you met at that party 6 years ago, and even different from the one you met again at the community center. You and Tommy have shown me what really matters in life. I promise to spend every day making up for the years I missed, being the father Tommy deserves and the husband you deserve. Our story didn't start perfectly, but I promise you it will be perfect from here on out." Sarah squeezed his hands, her own tears falling freely. "James, when I found those letters, I thought I wanted revenge. I thought making your father pay for what he did would somehow heal all the wounds of the past. But what I found instead was something much more valuable. The truth, forgiveness, and a love I never expected. You've shown me that people can change, that the past doesn't have to define our future. I promise to build that future with you, day by day, with honesty and love." Tommy, standing between them, looked up with a bright smile. "Does this mean I can call you Dad now? For real?" The gathered guests laughed through their tears as James knelt down to his son's level. "Yeah, buddy. For real. Forever." After the ceremony, during the small reception, Maxwell stood to make a speech. His hands trembled as he held his notes, but his voice was strong. "When I was a young man starting Rothschild Industries, I had a vision of building something that would last, something my children could be proud of. Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what really mattered. I chose power over people, pride over integrity, and in doing so, I nearly destroyed 2 families, the Mitchells and my own." He turned to Eleanor. "I can never fully repay you for what I took from you, but I promise the Restored Charity Foundation will help countless other single mothers, with you as its new director." Then to Sarah, "You came into our lives seeking justice, and in doing so, you helped restore not just your family's honor, but the heart of ours." Finally, to James and Tommy, "And you too. You represent everything I should have valued all along: family, love, and the courage to face the truth." Later that evening, as the reception wound down, Sarah found Tommy and James out on the mansion's terrace, having a snowball fight. She watched them play, her heart full of a joy she'd never expected to feel. "They're beautiful together," Eleanor said, joining her daughter. "Tommy has James's laugh." "He does," Sarah agreed, leaning against her mother. "Are you really okay with all of this, Mom? Working with Maxwell at the foundation?" Eleanor smiled softly. "Healing takes many forms, sweetheart. Sometimes it means walking away, and sometimes it means staying to build something better from the ashes of what was destroyed." Inside, Maxwell watched the scene through the window. His son and grandson playing in the snow, Sarah and Eleanor talking softly, all of them somehow forging a new kind of family from the wreckage of the past. The weight of his guilt was still there, but alongside it now was something new: hope. "Grandpa!" Tommy's voice carried through the glass. "Come help me and Dad build a snowman." Maxwell hesitated, but James caught his eye and nodded. Slowly, the older man made his way outside into the gentle snowfall. As they built the snowman together, grandfather, father, and son, Sarah watched from the terrace, remembering all the Christmases she and Tommy had spent alone, all the times she'd wished for a real family. The path here had been painful and complicated, full of hurt and betrayal, but standing here now, watching 3 generations of Rothschild men laugh together in the snow, she knew they had all ended up exactly where they were meant to be. Later that night, after Tommy had fallen asleep in his new room at the mansion, Sarah found James in the library. He was holding an old photograph, himself at Tommy's age, playing in this same snow. "Do you regret any of it?" he asked as she sat beside him. "Coming back into my life? Giving me a chance to be Tommy's father?" Sarah took his hand, feeling the weight of his new wedding ring. "The only thing I regret is not finding you sooner, not giving us all a chance to heal sooner." James pulled her close, kissing her softly. "Merry Christmas, Mrs. Rothschild." Sarah smiled against his lips. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Rothschild." Outside, the snow continued to fall on New York City, covering everything in a clean white blanket, like a fresh page, ready for a new story to begin. In the mansion's many rooms, a new kind of family slept peacefully: a boy who had found his father, a woman who had found justice and love, a man who had found redemption in responsibility, and 2 older souls who had finally found a way to make peace with the past. The scandal would fade, the company would recover, and the restored charity would help countless families. But more importantly, within these walls, love had found a way to heal what greed had broken, and the true spirit of Christmas, forgiveness, redemption, and the power of family, had worked its quiet miracle once again. As the clock struck midnight, marking the official start of Christmas Day, the soft light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, promising a new day and a new beginning for the unified Rothschild-Mitchell family, proof that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. What did you think of Sarah and James's story? Do you believe in second chances, like the ones Maxwell received? Or should some actions never be forgiven? Let us know in the comments. Would you have kept Tommy's identity a secret if you were Sarah? What would you have done in James's position when discovering the truth about his father? If this story touched your heart, don't forget to support us with a like and subscribe. Your support helps us bring powerful, emotional stories like this one to you every single day. And if you're ready for another emotional journey that will keep you on the edge of your seat until the very end, the video on your left will give you that same mix of intense feelings and unexpected revelations that will stay with you long after it ends. You won't want to miss it. Let's build this amazing community together, one story at a time. See you in the next video.